Welcome to another edition of Beyond the Sermon. I'm Matt Hotho, the Director of Production and Online Engagement.
And I'm Magrey, deVega, the Senior Pastor.
And starting just last week, you're actually able to listen to these as well on our podcast feed. So whether you're listening on podcast or watching on YouTube, thanks so much for being here for this conversation. So Magrey, we're going to dive deeper into your sermon on Mother Teresa. And where I want to really hone in today for this conversation is the twist in your sermon. Mm-hmm. That part where we, as all of us discovered in 2007, that Mother Teresa had this real dark night of the soul, this real experience through her own journals and letters that she written about how she struggled with darkness and a disconnection with God. So set that up again for us, kind of a little bit about kind of what those letters contained, maybe what they contain, what they don't contain.
Right.
I think sometimes we have some misconceptions about that.
Well, first of all, how striking it is for us to think that any of us who journal or have private conversations, letters or otherwise with other people, might someday be published for everyone to see. She did give explicit instructions that all of this correspondence needs to be destroyed after she died, which itself is an indication of how she felt herself about these periods of dryness. Even though there is strong conclusion toward the end of this book that she learned to embrace the doubts and periods of what she called dryness or darkness in her life and learned to accept them as part of her identification with Jesus, she still felt like this was not something to be publicly displayed. And I think we can all certainly understand why we wouldn't want what essentially feels like dirty laundry to be out there. But as I said in the sermon, this dynamo of charitable compassion who seems so monumentally above what we're able to strive for in our lives, all of a sudden becomes that much more accessible. Mm-hmm. Because in her deepest, most interior life, she was going through the kinds of spiritual experiences that are, as it turns out, very, very common, not just among significant spiritual influences like her, like Job, like Paul, like Jesus, like John Wesley, but that are common for all of us. So might it be helpful to just read one more little section?
Yeah, definitely.
For journal. Yeah. So this is some correspondence that she had with Archbishop Ferdinand Perrier, who I said in the sermon became one of her significant spiritual mentors and counselors. And she wrote to him these words: "Please pray for me. The longing for God is terribly painful, and yet the darkness is becoming greater. What contradiction there is in my soul. The pain within is so great that I really don't feel anything for all the publicity and the talk of the people. Please ask Our Lady to be my mother in this darkness." It does remind me of the poems that I read last week from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Mm-hmm. There on the confines of his own prison cell, he's asking of himself some deep, soulful self-reflection about who am I? Everyone out there says that I am this way, presenting myself to be this compassionate, genuine person, even in the midst of prison. And here in this letter, Mother Teresa is saying, even with all this publicity and all of the greatness that is being ascribed to her, she's feeling either deep pain or nothing at all. And that is a very real experience.
Yeah. I don't think we used this phrase last week, but imposter syndrome comes to mind, right? Like, especially for her in this moment of the accolades and everybody, was looking up to her, I would imagine. She was getting news coverage, that kind of thing. And what she couldn't say in the interview, probably because how do you say that in an interview to someone that you don't even know?
Right.
Hey, actually, I'm not so sure about this whole thing.
Right.
Or not that I'm not so sure about it, but the interior life just isn't there right now. Like, it's dry, it's dark, that kind of thing. You can't just say that to Dan Rather.
That's right. That's right.
Like, you can't just say that in the
or a Barbara Walters.
Right. Exactly.
All right.
Yeah. So I think her hands were tied a little bit, which is probably why she did it so much through letters and through journaling. I think Bonhoeffer is coming at it from a different angle because he's going through a trauma of being in prison.
That's true.
Certainly.
That's very true.
And is trying to find just the interior life of this character and all that he was going through, but focusing again Mother Teresa, I think there's something that we can all take from it, less from Bonhoeffer because we're not going to be in a prison cell, hopefully.
Right.
But I think we all struggle with imposter syndrome in our faith in some way, right? We look at someone else who's maybe more holy or has it more together or posts Instagram videos of themselves reading the Bible, or they seem to know a lot. Can you talk about that struggle maybe in your own interior life,
Sure.
as someone who's been in ministry for quite some time?
Sure. Not just in my profession, but any of us who have different roles, whether those roles be our occupation or the roles we play in our homes or in our social networks or our communities, we all struggle with this distinction between what we do and how we're perceived, the externalities of who we are, and then the deep, soulful self-reflection that inevitably happens, whether we do it intentionally or whether it bubbles up existentially in whatever dark nights of the soul we struggle with. Sometimes those happen at 3:30 in the morning, or sometimes they happen just catching us off guard when we start to think about deep existential realities that we are trying to hide from other people. So we all struggle with it. The other way to look at it is, for all of our strengths, and all of us do have strengths, our personalities, our achievements, our talents all have certain strengths. There are always corresponding shadows. There's always this side of who we are that we're trying to tamp down in order to accentuate our strengths, whatever those strengths are. And the task for us is not to deny those shadows, but to learn to embrace them, which is a very hard thing to do. A perfectionist, for example, needs to learn to embrace their own mistakenness. A wise person, or at least a person who wants to come across as wise, needs to learn how to embrace their own ignorance and their foolishness and learn to say, I don't know. A joyful person, an effervescent person, needs to learn how to embrace pain. This is all part of the human experience. So for Mother Teresa, a person who had developed this reputation of being compassionate and helpful, empathetic, and other-oriented, apparently reveals to us the importance of learning how much she was in need of compassion from other people, how helpless she felt. That was the shadow to her profound strength. Now, the good news that we learn from Mother Teresa is that she learned to embrace it by incorporating the guidance from other people. Like I said, Archbishop Ferdinand Perrier, Father Neuner, who I mentioned in the sermon, and lots of other people with whom she had correspondence that's reflected in this book, shows us the virtue of seeking spiritual counsel. For some people, it might be a spiritual director. Mm-hmm. For some people, it may be a therapist, a professional licensed psychotherapist, which I have espoused many times throughout my ministry, or at least a trusted friend, a family member or a colleague. And at the very least, to write it out, to externalize it the way she did in her private journals. Now, hopefully none of our private journals will ever be published, but just by doing that, she models for us the need to embrace that shadow by externalizing it. So imposter syndrome is a common part of the human experience, whether you're a minister or a church worker or anything that we try to do in a public setting. There's always that shadow that's part of it. That's all natural. And the more we try to ignore that, the stronger that imposter sense becomes. And that's what she was exhibiting here in her journals.
Yeah. I think when I thought about her journaling, what struck me was that, millennial, I don't journal.
Sure. Yeah.
No matter how many times someone will tell me,
right,
hey, you should really write those feelings out. I don't journal. And I think that's something that I'm constantly convicted of in some ways, because, I don't know if any of you can relate. Maybe younger people who are listening to this can relate, but when you don't journal it, when you don't get it out, it just becomes this interior noise of self-doubt, of just kind of turning over. It's, in a different way, it's kind of like a thorn that just kind of like, not to quote Paul, but kind of like lives in your side a little bit, that always bothers you, but then you don't get it out, and so you don't get to sense what it is and feel what it is. I think something that I'm taking from your sermon and from what Mother Teresa kind of models here is the need to get it out, is the need to put your own self-doubt out there for people to see and experience. So I talked about the one time I preached a couple of months ago about how, therapy and seeing a counselor has helped me kind of find balance in my life. I think journaling would go a step further instead of writing down those tapes that play in my head sometimes that were sometimes I think of her Dark Night of the Soul and reading it in a 2024 kind of way.
Right.
I'm like, what if she was just depressed? Not just depressed, but what if she was really struggling with like some mental health issues, and we have better language and comfort talking about those nowadays. Up in 97, certainly in the 1900s, I mean, that wasn't talked about as much,
That's right.
So I wonder if for some of us reading her story or hearing about that, we might think, gosh, we feel that way. Are we okay? Yes, we're okay. Yes, journaling can help us get that stuff out to talk about it. So Magrey, I want to give you kind of the final word here. And I want you to share something from your book, Questions Jesus Asked, which I'm going to, if you haven't read that book, it's a great one. It's a 6-week study that Magrey did on questions that Jesus asked in the Gospels. But there's one question in particular that you dove into, which was when Jesus was talking to the storm. I believe it's in Matthew 4. And he says, be still to the storm. You reference that to some ways that you've helped yourself be still in moments when your mind is kind of racing. Can you share that as we kind of wrap up?
Yeah, I appreciate that connection because when Jesus got up in the midst of the storm, when the disciples woke him up and they said, Jesus, do something, we're dying. Before he addressed the storm that was outside threatening their lives, he chose instead first to address the storm within the hearts of the disciples. So the first thing he said was not, storm, be still. He asked the disciples the question, why are you afraid? And many times when I have read that passage of scripture, I thought Jesus was being condescending or judgmental, saying, now, why in the world are you afraid? I mean, because the answer to that question should have been obvious with the wind and the waves. But I like to imagine Jesus asking the question more out of curiosity and more out of a sense of getting the disciples to externalize the source of their fear, which Mother Teresa did often through her journals, through her letters, where Jesus was not saying, why are you guys afraid? He was saying instead, now, why are you afraid? What is the source of your fear? Let's talk about that for a moment as we're being drenched and being threatened with our lives. Let's pause for a moment and ask the question, what is the source of your fear? That's what I see a lot in the letters here by Mother Teresa. She is going deeply into the questions, why am I feeling darkness? Why am I feeling emptiness? And one of the techniques I talk about in Questions Jesus Asked is to address that fear as if you're talking to a person that is externalized to you. So in other words, rather than feeling the fear, which is hard, which is certainly easy to do in that moment, address that fear and say, now, why am I being so affected by you right now? What is it that you are doing to me? And then start practicing your own agency to not only name and externalize that fear, but then to put it in its place. And not to fight against that fear, because sometimes fighting against fear or fighting against grief or worry or sadness simply arms them with more power than they deserve, but simply name them, acknowledge them, and then to simply allow them to pass by. And I just find it fascinating that Jesus did that first, asking the disciples about the source of their fear before he decided to do something about the wind and the waves and the storm itself.
Right.
Which I think, as I say in that book, there were 2 miracles that day, not just calming the storm outside them, but calming the storm within them.
Yeah, and I think within ourselves, sometimes we get so caught up in the external that's happening, the bills to pay, the relationships that are wacky, the things that aren't breaking our way, that we don't deal with that internal life too, that is also causing those things as well, because we're acting out of fear, anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, thanks so much for sharing that, Magrey. And again, the book that he referenced was Questions Jesus Asked.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Questions Jesus Asked is the book that Magrey wrote, where he kind of shares that story. And then this is Mother Teresa's collection of journal writings and letters called Come Be My Light. So thanks so much for joining us for today's episode of Beyond the Sermon. We will be back with you next week.